Thank you for joining me today. So my name is Shannon Sauro, and I'm an applied linguist at Malmö University, where I train teacher educators. And I do research on using different kinds of technology and different ways of teaching to teach language better. And so today I'm going to be talking about a project that we did using fan fiction for language teaching. So first off, for those of you who don't know what fan fiction is, it's the stories that people write about the things that they like a lot. So people who like movies, who like books, who like sports teams, who like bands, they may write stories about their favorite character or sports player if they worked in a coffee shop. Or if they weren't happy with the way a book ended, they may write a different ending. Or if they want to know more about the characters, they may explore them a little differently. So to put it another way, fan fiction is what people write when they're not done with what they like. They really enjoy it and they want more. So there's a lot of fan fiction out there. And many people write in fan fiction in many different languages for fun. I've just got a picture of one website where you can find a lot of fan fiction available in over 60 different languages. And there's been research carried out on people who use fan fiction to develop their own language skills, whether it's English or Finnish or Japanese. But what we don't see much of is whether you can actually use fan fiction for language teaching. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So you might be wondering, why use fan fiction for language teaching? And to answer this, I'm going to talk about an educational framework that we often see in language teaching, called task-based language teaching. And it's a framework where we create activities in the classroom, tasks, that represent what students are doing with language outside the classroom. So a lot of task-based language teaching is work-related, so things you might do for your job with English, or things that you might do for school, like writing papers. But what we've noticed, and we see a lot of this in Sweden, is that people use language, English in particular, for a lot of other things. They do it for fun. There's a lot of language play. So people use English for watching movies, for reading books, for talking about those movies, for playing games. There's a huge gaming community online and in English. But we also see people using English for writing fan fiction and other stories. And when we look at storytelling, we see that requires a really high level of English language ability. So we were interested in looking at what kind of skills and abilities students might develop if we had them doing fan fiction in a university classroom. So that's our question. Can fan fiction actually be used in an actual classroom setting to support language learning? And to answer this question, we went to a class of students who were in their first semester being trained to be secondary school English teachers and took them on a bit of an adventure with The Hobbit. So a little bit about this adventure. We call it the blogging Hobbit because all of this writing took place in a blog. And this course was offered in students' first term of study, and it's called English Studies and Education, Language, Text, and Culture. And it's a 10-week course for students to focus on being able to summarize and read and analyze literary texts, but also to be able to do creative writing of their own. And it's to help them develop skills for the teaching of reading literary texts to their own future students in school. So what exactly did we have our students do? Here's the quest. We began with 55 students, so it was a pretty big class, and we divided them into smaller groups of 3 to 6. And each group was given several tasks that they had to complete. But overall, they had to write a collaborative story, a fan fiction story. So each student selected a favorite character from Tolkien's The Hobbit. We had a lot of dwarves, a couple of elves, a few dragons, that sort of thing. And in their group, they worked together with their partners to outline a possible story that they would tell together. This is called a roleplay game, where they would take turns telling parts of the story back and forth. And they were doing this in a blog. So they outlined their story, got into their blog, and then each of them wrote at least 6 paragraphs from the voice of their character. So they needed to do careful research on Tolkien's writing to represent the style of their character, whether they were writing like a dwarf or like a hobbit or like Gollum. They wrote their stories, posted it on the blog, and then they wrote a reflective paper where they talked about the choices they made and gave an oral presentation about that. And in addition, they had the opportunity to watch the second Hobbit film, The Desolation of Smaug, which came out last fall. So some of them did that as well. So what did we find? Students identified that they did a lot of careful, very careful reading in order to write their stories. Here's one who wrote about the character Bombur, who has a very small part in Tolkien's story. She wrote, "Usually, I just plow through books like these to get to a story, but to suddenly look for gaps where we could create another story, or to actually put myself in the mind of Bombur, gave me even more knowledge of the book." So they felt like they deepened their reading and understanding of the text. But it also helps students who actually don't like writing much. This might sound funny, but we get plenty of future English teachers who don't like writing in English, even though they like reading in English. So we have one student who actually wrote from the perspective of Smaug, who said, first of all, let me start by saying, I'm not a fan of creative writing. I enjoy reading, but I absolutely loathe writing. With that said, I was pleasantly surprised with this task. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, and I also think it's an excellent way of writing because of the help you can get from your fellow group members. We had many students who said this was the first time they ever wrote fiction in any language, and they were initially really worried about it, but because they did it in a group, they got feedback and support from their partners, and they got a lot of help and were able to do that. So that was a very positive outcome overall in the story writing. But maybe we want to look at how successful was the writing. How good were these stories? What did they come up with? So often when we talk about evaluating language, we focus on things like how good was the grammar or the vocabulary, was it very accurate? And that's something called linguistic competence, which is of course very important. But when we look at overall advanced level language learning, we're interested in more than just the grammar, the pronunciation, and the vocabulary. We're interested in whether you actually use language appropriately and well. So we're looking at what's referred to as sociolinguistic competence here. What's appropriate in which situation and with which speakers or readers or context. And this is a part of overall communicative competence, which is the overarching goal we see in Sweden for English language learning and teaching. So in other words, did these students succeed in using language that was appropriate for storytelling and not for other functions, like writing an academic essay? And yes, they were. We had students who were commenting on the choices they made, so we went back and forth, looking at their own writing as well as their reflective essays. So here's an example of a writing sample from Secrets of the Last Homely House, from a student who wrote from Bilbo's character. He's the main character, he's the hobbit of the story. And we can see, just I've highlighted here, by all the good apricot marmalade I've ever eaten, he goes on to exclaim, that this student said she found Bilbo a worrying character, and he's not become the great adventurer he is later on. So she tried to use worrying expressions and certain exclamations like dear me and miserable me, and also tried to make reference to a lot of food. She wrote, I tried to imitate his typically English prudency, which is very, very Hobbit-like, and to refer to the comforts of food in his voice. So we could see how she carefully read the text to use her own expressions that captured how Bilbo and other hobbits incorporate reference to food a lot in their conversation. We also saw students pay very close attention to Tolkien's own writing style. They observed he had a tendency to use very old-fashioned language, but he also used certain literary techniques because he was telling a children's story. And we see this in an example from one of the stories called The Wooden Bridge, voicing the author, where the student writes at the very end about Bombur, Bombur, it's time for you to start hauling, or you'll receive a one-way ticket down the waterfall, Keely yelled. That got Bombur moving faster than ever, except the time they ran from the skin changer, but that comes later in the story. So we have an example of foreshadowing by breaking the fourth wall and kind of acknowledging we're telling you a story. And this is something that Tolkien does in his own writing as he's addressing his audience. So our students use some of these same literary techniques. They also paid attention to grammar, and that was particularly important for certain types of characters. So Gollum is another character who features in The Hobbit, and he's an interesting character with a very interesting way of speaking. He likes to speak in riddles. So we also have a student who wrote a lot of rhyming speech, but he noted that Gollum also has certain grammatical errors that he regularly makes in his speech. And so the student tried to make sure he captured those same grammatical errors without being too confusing for his reader. So we can see an example here. It is lying still, yet it spins around. It tries to move, but its body is bound. And because of the precious it stole, fool us again, and they eats it whole. So we've got a subject-verb agreement problem. But that's typical of the way that Gollum speaks. So the student also went on to say one of the advantages they found about this assignment was that this kind of reading and writing made them go back to the text almost like it was a grammar book or dictionary to pay very, very careful attention to the exact kind of grammar that was being used. So that was an interesting thing coming out of this. But aside from looking at the specific textual examples, and I'm sorry this is a very small image up here, I wanted to also look at overall language. Did the language of the stories look like storytelling? And one way I had of doing this was by comparing it to other stories that exist. So there's an online database of texts in English called the COCA. It's a corpus of contemporary American English. So a little bit of a mismatch because Tolkien was writing in British English, not contemporary. But it collects thousands and thousands and thousands, actually millions of words of English. And they're organized in different subgroups. So you have fiction texts, you have news stories, you have academic writing. And what you can do is plug in your own writing and compare the vocabulary that's used to see what other kinds of texts it looks like. So here's an example that I put in from the story Secret of the Last Homely House. And we've got 3 categories here of words in blue, words in green, words in yellow. And words in red represent academic language. But the blue words are the 1 to 500 most frequently occurring words in all this collection of text. So they include a lot of things like function words, like prepositions, or basic verbs, or pronouns. And we can see that in this story, of all the words generated, 71% are in that first most commonly occurring category. The next group in green, that's the next most occurring group, between 501 and 3,000 most frequent, so a little bit more advanced. And we have 12% of the text is in that group. And the final group, this is the rarer language that doesn't occur as much in the corpus. 18% of the students' texts are in yellow. And when we clicked on these words, when I went to look at them, I found that they included words that drew upon fiction texts in particular. So what we found is that about 20% of this language in the stories looked a lot like what you would find exclusively in fiction texts. And also, only 1 to 2% of the words look like academic language. And that's good, because we don't want a story to look like an essay. The language should be very different. So I was a bit curious, though. All my students' stories look kind of similar in their vocabulary profiles, but how did they compare to actual stories? So I went online and found actual fan fiction that was similar to the fan fiction my students were writing. I went to Archive of Our Own and I found a story called The Shire, Food, Food, Food by Fuzzy Books. And we can see it's a little under 5,000 words, so that's similar length to my students' stories. And what we had in there was, I put this into the corpus to search and find the linguistic profile. And what we found, again, and I'm going to compare it with the last one I showed, is they were very similar in the kind of vocabulary that they generated. So about 70 to 75% of the words were in the first category, 10 to 15 in the second category, and 15 to 25 in the third category. So they looked like actual real-world fan fiction. In other words, these students' stories look like what we hoped them to be. So this was kind of a hopeful thing here. I found that very positive. What I want to conclude with, though, are some warnings, some things to watch out for if anyone else is interested in doing a project like this, and for us in our next step. So there's certain bits of advice for things to work better. First off, I recommend you look at fandom when you're selecting a story. Not all stories are good for fan fiction writing. So I went to Archive of Our Own just to show you some examples here. A text that I had to read in high school, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. There are only 2 stories. That doesn't generate a lot of fan fiction, and it's not really a surprise. It's a pretty difficult text. The Hobbit, though, we can see 4,500 different stories here. So that represented a very rich area, and that makes sense for the kind of task we wanted to do. The Hobbit has a lot of characters, it's an imaginative environment, there's a lot of room for students and writers to play. And at the bottom, I've just got another example. Some stories, some movies, in fact, are so popular that there are tens of thousands of texts out there, like we see in the Sherlock Holmes fandom right now. So that's a very rich area for a lot of examples. And you can look at those particular types of stories as models for the kind of tasks you can have your own students doing. The next bit of warning, and this isn't really a warning, it's a suggestion. It's a truth universally acknowledged that not all students like reading, and some of them will struggle a bit more with finding the voice of their character. So what we recommend is what we did, finding a story that has multimedia support. So that was the case here with The Hobbit. Many of the students had read the book, but many hadn't read the books before the course. But they were familiar with the movie, and they found going to the film, like this one student said, I normally don't read books, I mostly prefer to watch movies, and that was a fun challenge for me. And he said watching the movie helped him get a better understanding of his character and gave him more to write about. So I think that helped with the success of the project. And finally, one problem that we had was the technology. Like I said, students produce their stories on blogs. And one of the things we discovered that even though in fandom and online, people do a lot of fan fiction writing in blogs, the students in our class didn't really know how to use a blog. Most of them had never used one before, and they sort of struggled with it. So we're moving on to the next stage of our project, which is beginning tomorrow, actually. And we're going to try to use different technology tools that represent what our students are more familiar with, whether that's Facebook or Google Docs. So we recommend that you use what's ubiquitous from your students' perspective, and also determine what technology they need to use. So some of them were actually really happy to have had to have used the blog, because they knew that that was something they would have to use in their own teaching. So finding technology that fits is important. And with that, I'm going to wrap up, and we're off on our next big adventure with stage 2 of the project beginning tomorrow. Thank you very much.